Good evening, everyone. I am Rebecca Hernandez, Director of the American Indian Resource Center on campus. I am sharing the land acknowledgement tonight. UCSC is located on the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amah Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the annual convocation and the 5th birthday party of the Center for Innovations in Teaching and Learning. My name is Jody Green. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and the founding director of the CITL. I remember exactly where I was when I received the email at the beginning of April 2016. It might even have been April Fool's Day, announcing the founding of a new campus teaching center and the call for a faculty director. I had two immediate and simultaneous responses. First, the uncanny sense that my life was about to change direction definitively and irrevocably. And second, an overwhelming urge to hit the delete button. This is not the place to tell the full story of everything that's happened since then. The very short version is that I did hit delete, but that kind friends immediately began forwarding the email to me just in case I hadn't seen it. And I finally gave in to their collective confidence that this would be a good thing to pursue. 5 years later, I can say that they, and some of them are you, were right. The past 5 years have been humbling, inspiring, full of learning and of work, and much of the time, really a lot of fun. I have come to know, love, and respect the unbelievable commitment of so many of my colleagues, faculty, staff, administrators, to transforming the culture and practice of teaching and learning at UC Santa Cruz. I've seen so many instructors at every level throw yourselves into the hard work of redesigning your courses, rethinking your teaching and mentoring practices, and reframing what it means to be an educator in the 21st century. It's not always easy to work at a world-class research university that is also stepping into a new role and a new set of responsibilities as a minority serving institution. It's even harder when the institution in question is a young public university in an era of plummeting public support for higher education. While we are inevitably going through growing pains as we figure out how to be a very different kind of institution than the one founded in 1965, I also remind myself and anyone else who will listen that we have a powerful history we can draw on as we do the hard work of transforming UC Santa Cruz into the institution we would like to think we already are. So what is that history? We were founded as the only public research institution in this country or anywhere else that is also an alternative school. We had no grades, no departments. We led with high impact practices like undergraduate research and experiential student-centered learning. Educational innovation is in our DNA. At the same time, we take pride in our long-standing centering of values of social justice, activism, and anti-authoritarianism. We may not live up to those aspirations and practices all the time, but we should look to them as standards we can hold ourselves to when we fall short. As I've collaborated with partners in nearly every part of the campus over the past 5 years, I have seen firsthand the way these educational and political commitments continue to ground our work and our collective life at UC Santa Cruz. We have far more in common than we generally recognize. That's something I didn't understand when I started doing this work, and it is in turn what has made any success we have had at CITL possible. The best part of the past 5 years has without question been the opportunity to collaborate with so many faculty, staff, and administrators, and graduate student researchers and educators. While offering workshops and building websites are valuable and necessary contributions to educational development work, the best part of this job is learning alongside, learning in community, and witnessing the incredible curiosity, creativity, dedication, and generosity of the people who work and learn here. The past year's challenges, pandemic, racial reckoning, labor unrest, and fire have often been exhausting and heartbreaking, but we have also seen the resilience and courage of this community's educators. It has been nothing short of awe-inspiring for me personally and for me in my professional life. The work attributed to CITL has truly been a collective endeavor, and while I could never possibly thank everyone who has helped us to get where we are today, I'm going to take a moment here to name some names because I believe it's important to stop and notice what we can accomplish when we work together. So I want to start by thanking Herbie Lee, the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and my boss, who has genuinely given us a wide pasture in which to build this little startup into something a little less little. I want to thank CPEVC Lori Klutzer and the academic deans for supporting our work so thoroughly and for helping us to keep going and to make the connections that we need to make across the campus. I want to thank the Academic Senate Committee on Teaching, particularly this year, Maureen Callanan and Rebecca Hurtis, for being such fantastic partners in doing this work. I want to thank the CITL staff, Kendra, who was the first to come on and join me, and that really changed everything, and who has single-handedly piloted our graduate programs from the beginning. Robin Duncan, the assistant faculty director, who was the next person to come in and really work closely with me and to help build things like the new Faculty Teaching Academy. Sam Foster, our managing director, Nandini Bhattacharya and Jesse Dubrail, our faculty directors, Hillary Bennett, who is our tireless right hand, Nori Chai, our newest team member, our STEM equity coordinator, and all the GSRs who built our programs. I want to thank all the faculty fellows that we've had at CITL. That is for sure the program that really keeps me going, from which I derive so much of my energy. And I want to thank the faculty steering committee, both the actual members and the shadow members who are steering us. That is Silvana Falcone, Enrico Ramirez Ruiz, Rebecca Covarrubias, Suzanne Alonso, Belle Rodriguez, no longer with us at UCSC, and Barbara Rogoff. That really is the A-team that has helped us understand how to do our work. Finally, I want to thank for this pandemic year in particular, my wonder twin, Michael Tassio, the Director of Online Education. Michael, his team, and the team at ITS have made this enormous lift of pandemic teaching possible. And I really cannot imagine what the last year would have been like without his expertise and leadership and skill. I want to thank the Division of Student Affairs and Success and the HSI Initiatives team for being co-sponsors of tonight's convocation with Dr. Estela Maria Ben-Simon, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And I want to thank University Relations, especially Kristen Palma and her team in special events. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chancellor Cindy Larive and CPEVC Lori Klutzer to say a few words about what's been happening with teaching and learning at UCSC over the past few years. Cindy, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jody. And I'm so delighted to join in this celebration of CITL and the excellence it catalyzes and supports. So many universities have a center for teaching and learning, but our CITL is an amazing jewel. One of the things that makes CITL especially impactful is the work being done to support faculty in the development of inclusive curricula, course materials, and pedagogies to help every student succeed, so that at UC Santa Cruz, students don't have to start out ahead to get ahead. Educational equity is one of the most important priorities for our campus for the UC system and for the country as a whole. Our campus set a target of closing equity gaps by 2030. Actually, I hope we can double down to achieve that goal even sooner. Closing equity gaps must involve everyone on campus, from those who support students through advising, health and wellness, financial aid, tutoring, our resource centers, and so much more. But the important piece of the equity puzzle is our instructors. We can provide additional student learning support, great advising, peer networks, and so on. But course design and delivery, the design of entire curricula, and integrated learning goals and outcomes are absolutely essential to meeting our student success goals. I am so proud of our campus for its election to the Association of American Universities, the AAU, and the decades of faculty effort and research excellence that recognition represents. And I'm proud that UC Santa Cruz is the youngest member of the AAU and one of only 4 members that are Hispanic serving institutions. But I also recognize that it can be a challenge to do the work needed to support educational equity at a Research One university. As a campus, we must be intentional in providing support for faculty and graduate students to revamp the way they teach and mentor, taking a more research-based approach to these tasks, while also recognizing and valuing the campus's amazing world-class research. We also need to be intentional in the ways that undergraduate research and other active learning experiences, whether they're in the laboratory, a field site, the library, or in the community, are integrated into the curriculum, into our learning outcomes, and importantly, into our faculty reward structures. CITL provides a welcoming and supportive learning community for scholars, complete with faculty fellows who serve as campus ambassadors. I'm so grateful to all of you who have supported this effort over the past 5 years. CITL's collaborations across the campus allow UC Santa Cruz to skillfully and ethically use data to track success and motivate change. As we imagine the future of CITL, its work to enhance learning is essential to achieving our campus goals and to providing the rich educational environment our students need and deserve. So congratulations, Jody, and all of those involved with CITL for 5 amazing years of work. And with you, I look forward to a very bright future. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our campus provost and EVC, Lori Kletzer, to make some additional remarks.
Thank you. It is so good to be here and to celebrate CITL and its 5-year anniversary. It's been 5 years of great accomplishment, and I'm looking forward to the next and the next 5 years. CITL is transforming how we think together about teaching and learning, and all the words in that sentence make a difference. Transforming, thinking together, and about teaching and learning. I am so grateful, like daily, on a daily basis, endlessly grateful to my faculty colleagues, all instructors and staff for the significant effort and resources the entire campus has put into changing the culture and practice of teaching and learning on campus in just 5 years. CITL says of itself, and I quote, "Inclusive and engaged teaching and learning to enable every educator and learner on campus to thrive." And how fortunate we are. I've been asked to reflect on the past and into the future and to consider just a bit what looks different now from the way things looked 5 years ago. Well, for those who know me, I wasn't actually here 5 years ago. I took a little hiatus. And so I wasn't around to experience and just learned this afternoon that Jody Green had deleted the email, that I wasn't here to experience that reimagining and the explosion of new ideas that happened right at the creation of the Center for Innovations in Teaching and Learning. That said, I am someone who was teaching in the classroom here in the 20th century, and I mean comfortably in the 20th century, not just the last few years. And I can tell you that now it makes an enormous difference to have a research-based teaching center on campus. Faculty at UCSC have always valued teaching, but now we're changing not only the practice, but the culture of teaching and learning on campus. And that is entirely due to CITL. The CITL of today is recognized for its support of faculty through an approach that is, again, support-based, grounded in research, and welcoming to faculty. Each one of the legs of that stool make a difference. I'm going to say them again: support-based, grounded in research, and welcoming to faculty. And that's a big difference from 5 years ago and 10 years ago, and honestly, the nearly 30 years ago when I first started teaching on this campus. CITL is, as from my position now as campus provost, CITL is integral to our priority goal of diversifying the faculty. We have a ways to go, and we continue at every moment to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion in our faculty hiring and retention. Supporting the inclusive pedagogy that our newest faculty and scholars often arrive here to offer is critical, as is how we support faculty as mentors in educating the scholars, activists, practitioners, and leaders of the next generation. CITL plays an enormous role in that. As I reflect over the, not quite 5 years for me in my experience, but over the decades, CITL is squarely in line with UC Santa Cruz's history of educational innovation and its focus on outstanding and creative approaches to teaching and learning. We are updating and keeping fresh that original mission, using now more technology, active learning techniques, and incorporating experiential learning, all of which require faculty to learn new things. And CITL does that. At its base, the campus, though, is staying true to its original values by directing resources to support faculty to ensure an excellent and innovative student experience. That has been our commitment now for more than half a century. I want to highlight one of CITL's signatures is its expanded notion of graduate student professional development. By revamping the campus-wide approach to TA training, we are trying to create multi-level teaching teams that can better support undergraduate student success. And we are also helping our graduate students develop into the next generation of higher ed professionals with a strong focus on equity and accessibility. I'd like to just drop a teaser, a special shout out to the newest activity in CITL, and that's Project Real. Check it out on the CITL website. This is all work that must be done for us to be true to our commitment to equity, to educational equity, and to social and racial justice. I am delighted to be here this afternoon to celebrate CITL and its accomplishments, to look to CITL again and again for inspiration, and to be a part of a very exciting future. Thank you again. Congratulations to CITL. And Jody, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you, Cindy, as well. And Lori, thank you especially for your shout out to Project Real. That's pretty exciting, and the teaching newsletter is going out tonight. So for those of you who receive that teaching newsletter, you will know what Project Real is. But with that, and I feel a little full of all these kind words, with that, we turn to the really great event of tonight, which is our visit from Dr. Stella Bensimon. I first met Dr. Bensimon when our former colleague, Pablo Rigarin, invited me to join a small group on a trip to USC for a 2-day equity planning institute. The institute was put on by USC's Center for Urban Education, founded in 1999 and until very recently directed by Dr. Bensimon. We arrived to discover that we were the only institution attending that was not a community college. And at some point, as we transitioned from the formal presentations by CUE staff to working in campus level groups to develop equity plans for our own schools, Dr. Bensimon came by our table and said, I wasn't sure what to do about a facilitator for this group since your situation is quite different from those of the other schools here. I've decided that I will be your facilitator. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to do what the educational theorist Torgny Roxana calls open my shame briefcase and say that I thought something at that moment like, well, that makes sense that she's working with us. We're the only four-year school here and we're a UC, so we're pretty special. So Dr. Bensimon's going to work with us. Little did I know that Dr. Bensimon, as she made achingly clear over the next 2 days, felt she had to work with us because our institutional equity skills were so rudimentary compared to the other institutions attending. Basically, we were placed in what you might now call the developmental track for equity-minded, racially just institutional skill building. I later learned that we are a prime example of what Dr. Bensimon, borrowing a phrase from a colleague, calls first-generation equity practitioners, this brilliant phrase that captures so much about being new at this game. We got our butts kicked over those 2 days at USC, and rightly so. And I became an instant super fan and relentless follower of Dr. Bensimon's work. I keep on my desk at all times and annoyingly regularly quote from her most recent book, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk. It's right here, co-authored with Tia Brown McNair and Lindsay Malcolm-Picot. CITL has distributed many, many copies of this book around campus to all new faculty and to many of our learning communities. I kind of feel like sometimes we should make it sort of like a Gideon's Bible for UC Santa Cruz and leave one quietly in the drawer of every office on campus. But seriously, if we were all to study this book, I truly believe we would be closer to becoming an institution of what Dr. Bensimon calls equity-minded practitioners. And I'm going to very briefly quote from the book here for those of you who are newer to this work and this conversation. So Dr. Bensimon defines 3 aims of equity work in general and racial equity work in particular. She writes, we describe racial equity as a project with 3 aims. 1, correct the educational injustices perpetrated by policies and practices that resulted in the systemic marginalization of populations whose ties to the United States came about involuntarily through enslavement, colonization, usurpation of territory, or genocide. 2, elevate anti-racism as an agenda that higher education must take on if we are ever to truly be the just and good society we imagine ourselves to be. And 3, make whiteness be seen as the problem that undermines higher education from serving as a societal model for racial justice. Correct educational injustices, elevate anti-racism, take on whiteness as an institutional structure. We have talked a lot about these goals this year at UC Santa Cruz, but I think all those of us who have been paying attention have come to see the extent to which those conversations are only just beginning in earnest. And now it's up to all of us to keep them going. It is an extraordinary honor for CITL and the campus to welcome the nation's leading thinker on the topic of educational equity in higher education at a time when the campus is increasingly identifying closing equity gaps and ensuring equitable outcomes for minoritized students as primary institutional priorities for the next decade and beyond. I have no doubt that our understanding of those goals and of what it would take to meet them will be profitably disrupted and significantly revised by tonight's speaker. Dr. Bensimon has recently left the Center for Urban Education to become director of Bensimon and Associates, consulting widely with higher ed leaders and professionals on topics related to racial equity and student success. We are so grateful to her for making time in her busy schedule to spend the evening with us. Her topic tonight is practicing equity with fidelity to racial justice, and there will be time for questions at the end. So please enter your questions into the little Q&A box if you have a question, and I'll feed it to Dr. Bensimon when we're done. And with that, it is with great and sincere pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Estela Bensimon.
Thank you. Thank you, Jody, for that wonderful introduction. I'm glad that I was not on camera because I was laughing when you were recounting our first meeting. It is true. It was UC Santa Cruz and all of those community colleges. And I remember saying, when you signed up, this is for community colleges. But anyway, I thought it was great that you all came with a team and we worked so well together. So it was my pleasure to have been your facilitator. I also want to congratulate you, Jody, and everyone else that is a member of CITL. I think it's a wonderful accomplishment. And I also want to thank Chancellor Larive and Provost Kletzer. I admire them for being here with us today and for celebrating your center. So let me see if I can, I'm going to share my screen so that I can do my presentation, and hopefully will all go well. And here it is. Let's see. So I hope that you can see my slides. Let me just tell you, first of all, I feel like I couldn't start today without acknowledging what's going on nationally in Minnesota, what is unfolding in terms of the most recent police murder and the case that's being tried against policeman Chauvin. And it's a call, I think, for all of us in higher education to think more deeply about how do we educate our students, both in terms of the history of this country and how to be actively anti-racist. I also want to acknowledge that the increasing attacks on Asian Americans is also very, very disturbing. So we have a new president that has made racial justice his agenda. And I hope that with that will come change. But indeed, the events of this past year have been extremely troubling. And so I'm glad that we are having this session together today because, as the Chancellor mentioned, instructors teaching is so important. And I think that now we have a special calling on how to not only impart our disciplines, but how to do so in a way which brings about change in the ways in which we think about people who are not like ourselves. So the title of my presentation is Practicing Equity with Fidelity to Racial Justice. And it's informed, the title is informed by very recent writings that I've done, mostly for Change Magazine. As Jody mentioned, I recently left USC. I retired. I still have a hard time saying that I retired. And so rather than writing lots of articles for peer-reviewed journals, I'm now writing more for Change and for a more general audience. And the notion of how to practice equity with fidelity to racial justice comes from a recent Change Magazine article in which I talked about reclaiming racial justice in equity. And I like to use that to give you background as to how I became involved in this work 20 years ago when I moved to Los Angeles 25 years ago from the East Coast. And at the time that I moved here, it was when everybody was talking about diversity, and the University of Michigan case was going on in terms of the use of race in admissions. And I looked around here in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, and most of the institutions of higher education, the Cal States, the community colleges, they had passed diversity. They were beyond stage 1 diversity. And the issue for me then became, so what does diversity matter? Does diversity turn into equity in educational outcomes? And what was really baffling to me was that there was also a very active, robust accountability agenda going on in higher education, in public higher education. Yet none of the indicators in those, accountability systems that were very complicated and dashboards and so forth actually had indicators of racial equity. So that's when I decided to work in this area. And I was really fortunate that the provost at the University of Southern California had launched an incentive program for projects that would further USC's strategic plan. And one of the features in the strategic plan was called the urban paradigm. So I applied for the incentive and I won. I won almost $1 million, which enabled me to establish the Center for Urban Education 20 years ago. So in doing the work of the center, one of the things that's very important is language. And as I have done this work, my understanding of language and its importance continues to evolve. So one of the things that it's important to establish the context for my talk today is that diversity and equity are not the same, even though often people use these terms interchangeably. So diversity has been much more about the emphasis on access and the representation of racial minoritized groups in the student body, valuing difference and providing equal treatment and inclusiveness. All of those things are part of diversity. And what's interesting is some of you may have read it yesterday in Inside Higher Education, there was an article about an analysis done by scholars from Princeton University. They looked at websites of universities. I can't remember how many, but it was maybe in the hundreds. And they looked at diversity statements. And one of the conclusions from their study was that the majority of institutions of higher education define diversity in very instrumental ways, meaning that diversity as an educational benefit, and that and rather than as a moral imperative. And they also conducted an experiment in which they showed these diversity instrumental statements and the moral diversity statements to white and racially minoritized students, and found that white students were much more comfortable with the instrumental definitions of diversity as an educational benefit, than with diversity as a moral imperative. So diversity has been both a good thing, but in many ways it has been subtractive to the racial justice agenda of the civil rights movement, which coincides with the founding of UC Santa Cruz in 1965. So UC Santa Cruz in 1965 must have been a very interesting place. Equity means it's about achieving parity in educational outcomes. And I will talk about what that means. But it is also about being critically race conscious and being aware of how our institutions and their practices are racialized and can disadvantage racially minoritized students. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So Jody has already mentioned how I define racial equity, racial justice. I define it as corrective justice for past wrongs. So for instance, I recently spoke about the reform of developmental education. I don't know if you're aware that in the community colleges, there's a new AB 705 legislative bill which mandates the elimination of remedial education courses. And I see that bill, AB 705, as a form of corrective justice for 50 years of segregating Black and Latinx and Indigenous students in non-credit remedial education courses that essentially cooled these students out of higher education. So that's an example of what I mean by corrective justice. It's also, I define equity as an anti-racist project. In other words, that we have to confront particularly institutionalized racism in our practices, in our structures and policies, and also decentering whiteness. So, instrumental definitions of diversity are essentially a way of centering whiteness in diversity statements, because those instrumental definitions are very much a way of accommodating for the discomfort that whites may feel about speaking about race specifically. Okay, so and I'm sharing these definitions again because a lot of times people do use the term equity without defining it and kind of as a rhetorical filler. And I'm trying to raise consciousness that we have to speak not only about equity, but we have to speak about racial equity. So I see racial equity as having two dimensions. One is what the accountability dimension. And what that means is that we need to measure racial equity and outcomes in terms of proportional representation, not against whites. A lot of times we compare, okay, how are Black students, how are Latinx students, how are Indigenous students doing compared to whites? I am trying to see how we can make the group its own benchmark. And I'll show you what I mean by this with this example. So for instance, and I'm showing a math course here. And the point of proportionality is that if 32% of the students in this math course are Latinx, I would like to see at the very end of that course, when we look at all the students who earned an A degree, that 32% of those students are Latinx. That's what I mean by proportionality. So how would this translate to UC Santa Cruz? Well, 28% of your students, your undergraduates, I believe, are Latinx, more or less. And so one of the ways you can think about this, and I gave this example earlier today, you have a school or college of engineering, and ideally 28% of engineering majors, let's say, would be Latinx. And ideally, among all of the students who earned a degree in engineering, 28% would be Latinx. I don't know if that's the way it is at UC Santa Cruz. It might be better. And that is one of the ways in which you can begin to think about closing the gaps in outcomes that have been mandated by the system. The other dimension of equity is the critical dimension. And I think that this is much more difficult for people to understand because it refers not to overt racism, but it refers to how institutionalized racism essentially runs through the veins of our institutions of higher education because they were created by and for white students. So even though you see Santa Cruz as a Hispanic serving institution, at one time, and maybe still is in some ways, it was a predominantly white institution. So if we want to do the work of racial equity, that is with fidelity to racial justice, we really have to be actively involved in understanding our structures, our practices, and how they might be racialized and dismantling them. So for instance, how we hire faculty, how we evaluate faculty. And today I will give some examples that are relevant to the instructional aspects. So in order to help us understand what do I mean by the critical dimension of racial equity, I am sharing with you a sculpture that is in Copenhagen. And this sculpture was built to depict the wealth inequality in the world. And there's an inscription in the sculpture which says the following: I am sitting on the back of a man. He is sinking under the burden. I would do anything to help him except stepping down from his back. And the reason why I use this to explain what I mean by the critical dimension of equity is because I think in many ways we do the same thing. You know, we may establish goals. We may say, you know, we're going to close gaps, but we need to give up something to achieve this. We need to give up power often. We need to give up the control of agendas. And that's what it means to engage in racial equity work with fidelity to racial justice. We cannot do racial equity work and expect nothing to change. And this is why it's so, so difficult. So I'm going to talk now about how I have gone about doing this work. And as Jody said, most of our faculty are what we have described as, actually James Gray, an instructor of mathematics at the Community College of Aurora, came up with this term, first generation equity practitioner. And when he talked about this term, you know, he said, you know, faculty are always talking about first generation students and why first generation students lack college knowledge and that they cannot go to their parents to ask for help and so on. So he said, well, I'm a first generation equity practitioner and I cannot go to my mother to ask her how to be equity minded. So that's essentially what our higher education institutions look like. We're filled with first generation equity practitioners. And so the issue is, how do we learn, how do first generation equity practitioners learn to be equity minded? So I'm defining equity mindedness as the following. Let's say that Professor John is a white professor. He needs to become aware of his own racial identity. He has to become aware that he is white, and in being white, it maybe enables him to see some things, but it also can hide much, and that his whiteness also influences how racially minoritized students view him. Professor John needs to be aware of racialized patterns in his own classroom, maybe in his own interactions with colleagues, in his research agenda, who he invites to be part of his, you know, research, and so on. And I'm going to show you what I mean by racialized patterns. he needs to become aware. Let's say that Professor John is in the sciences and that Professor John has a lab. He needs to become aware of how he goes about choosing who works in his lab. And is the way that he goes about making those choices benefiting racially minoritized students, or is it reproducing racialization in that he tends to choose the highest performance ever, regardless of what their racial ethnic background is? So that's what I mean by racial consequences of actions. And Professor John needs to learn how to engage in racial equity work that where he uses, faculty are very powerful. We have lots of resources, we have networks, we have knowledge. We can help students find research assistantships. You know, I, as a faculty member who taught PhD students, could help them find positions in fellowships, in faculty positions. I could call my friends. And so we can use those networks on behalf of those students who need them the most, or we can continue to use them on behalf of those students who have always had benefits. And if you're interested in this notion, I and Alicia Dowd and several others wrote an article that was published in the Review of Higher Education, and it was about STEM faculty and how STEM faculty engage as institutional agents of racial equity. So how do we bring about change in first generation equity practitioners? So it's not typically through a lecture like this one. We in higher education, we are academic organizations. And as academic organizations, we tend to respond much more, I guess, much more willingly to when we are involved in our own self-change. And that self-change can be brought about by being engaged in research, in inquiry, which is what we like to do. So the work that I have done has drawn from the work on critical participatory action research to engage faculty members, staff members, leaders. Also, I work with philanthropic organizations in actually having the tools that enable them to see how what they do every day, their routines, actually are in fact racialized. So here are many of the tools that we have created. You know, policy tools, data tools, we have syllabi tools, and the best way to show you how this works is by providing an example. So I told Jody as we were preparing for this talk that our work has been mainly with community colleges and also broad-based access institutions, like, you know, many of the Hispanic serving Cal State colleges. And so I said to her, if I show examples from the community colleges, will people think that, you know, this is not applicable to me? And so I'm telling you this because even though Jason Berg is a mathematics professor at the Community College of Denver, what he discovered through inquiry, it's something that you could also do. So I will show you what happened here. So Jason Berg was part of one of our projects, and we helped him. What you're seeing here is just one aspect of the activity that we engaged him in. But we had him code his gradebook. So instead of the column that you see as one, is the ethnicity, the racial ethnic background of the students, substituting for their names. And what you see in the rows are all of the things that go into a gradebook, which might be homework submission, tests, quizzes, attendance, and so forth. And to show you what happened when he did this, I'm going to let him tell you, and I am going to cross my fingers that you can hear it. Jody, if we're not able to hear it, somehow signal me, okay?
That's 65.4%. This is my college algebra. That's maybe like an average success in college algebra, but it doesn't really kind of show really or reflect the successes of minoritized students. So once we get the disaggregated data, which we weren't able to look at before this, now all of a sudden I can see, oh, wow. So that's 64%, actually 65% compromises mainly white students being successful and Latinx students being not as successful. So start to think, I've not really thought about minoritized students before and their success within my classes. I just thought that maybe students come to my class, they are either successful, they're not successful, are they putting the work in, are they dropping out of class early? But I hadn't thought about who or who's kind of just not been as successful as other students. Instead of just going through a syllabus, here's how we do the homework, here's where you go to look at how to get to the classroom material. Let's just teach a little lesson, we all go home, and that's the first day. It's very instructor driven, it can be, and that's what it used to be in the past. So I tried to turn this around to it being more student driven that first day. So I think that now this is a big turnaround in so much as my Latinx students, they're staying in the class, they're being successful, they're doing the homework, they're all part of the class, they're responding, they're talking in class, they're working with each other, they're working with other students. And I feel as though they do feel as though they're now almost like at the front of the class, not hidden at the back of the class. It may be that because I wasn't following, I wasn't talking to the students, I wasn't getting to know them, weren't getting to know me, that they were dropping from the class. And therefore, that shows that a lower success rate for the Latinx students. Whereas now you can see that I've got a large percent that are successful. They are now as successful as my white students. And I think it's because I am talking to them. They are feeling part of the class. I am talking one-on-one. We're working together a lot more. They're not just some student that I don't get to know and maybe drops out of the class after 5 weeks or isn't being as successful. This success, like I say, it does reflect the Q mindset, this equity mindset we've been working on. And also, you can't go back. Once you've done this, it is a way to talk to other instructors about. These aren't hard steps to take in the classroom. Little things about talking one-on-one with your students, maybe starting a little bit of the homework in the classroom, helping them within the classroom. First day activities. It's not just you at the front, students there, and it's all you. This mindset has changed the way I look at my students, the way I teach, the way I approach my teaching. And as you can see, it has been very successful this past year. So I would almost like to thank the Q. That's 65.4%.
So what Jason is saying is really important. One of the things that he said was that before he engaged in this work, he had never been given data by race and ethnicity for his courses. So what I would like you to think about is, if you are faculty members in the audience, whether you have had access to that kind of data and whether you have looked at it in this manner. And if not, do you think you would? The second thing he said is that he had never really thought about minoritized students. There is a typo there, as I see, and whether they were being successful or not. And so I mentioned earlier that it is important for faculty members to be racially aware and to be able to notice who is in their classes by race and ethnicity. To be colorblind is not equity work. He also discovered that his class was very much driven by him, and he made changes. It's interesting when he talks about Latinx students used to be in the back of the classroom, and now they're in the front and they're talking and they're participating. And the reason for that was that he actually made an effort to get to know them and for them to know him. And that changed the dynamics in his classroom. It changed the culture of his classroom. The other thing that he did is that homework was very important. And I think it is important in mathematics. And so in order to show students that the homework was doable, he established the practice of starting the homework in class. And that was, that just really changed things for the students. He also, he says, I can never go back. So he brought about his own change. And so some of you may be saying, well, you have no way of knowing that those outcomes that went from 33% to 85% were due to this activity. And of course, I agree with you. But what's really important is that Jason believes that. And because he believes that, he's going to continue to pay attention, and he's going to continue to examine what he's doing in the classroom, and will be keeping his eyes on the grades by race and ethnicity. And that's what he means when he says he cannot go back. So I'm going to show you then another example. It's really hard to talk in a webinar where I see no one and I have no idea what people are doing. We often hear, this is a cartoon about the syllabus, right? And we, when students might ask us questions, we'll tell them it's in the syllabus. And I think in our work, we have discovered that the syllabus is something that's really, really important. And so we created a tool, and our tools, by the way, are available publicly. And you can find them under Q.equity tools, I think, something like that. They're very easy to find. But this is a protocol that we developed to engage faculty members in a structured and rigorous review of their syllabi. And in order to illustrate how this works, I am going to show an example from another instructor in a community college. But again, what I'm going to show you is very relevant to you as well. So our tool looks at syllabi, looks at 6 features, and demystifying, creating a partnership, deconstructing, representing, validating, and welcoming. And those 6 features illustrate 3 ways of thinking about equity, which are explicated in the book that Alicia Dowd and I wrote, Engaging the Race Question. So demystifying, it represents fairness, in that students should have the information that they need to be able to succeed in a course. So for instance, demystifying may be how they're going to be graded. Welcoming, creating a partnership, and validating are examples of how we demonstrate caring for students, welcoming them through the syllabus to the class, showing them that learning is going to be a partnership between the faculty member and the students. And validating refers to, and this a term that comes from the work of Laura Rendon, where she has shown how important it is to recognize students' funds of knowledge and to validate them for them. A lot of times when we look at Latinx, Black students, Indigenous students, we may not recognize that they do have knowledge, and that it is important knowledge that contributes to their learning and our learning. And finally, representing and deconstructing are examples of equity as transformation. So, I will show you how this works out. So here is an example of welcoming from the syllabus of Jennifer Ortiz. She's an English instructor now at West Los Angeles Community College, but I met her when she was the chair of English at Los Angeles Tech, and she participated in our institutes and actually adopted the 6 features of our syllabus review and has turned them into her own syllabus. So this is the way that she shows welcoming.
Hello, if you're receiving this message, it is because you are registered for one of my English classes. My name is Professor Ortiz, pronouns she, her, hers, and I want to welcome you to fall semester 2020. Before we get started, I just want to say that I am so humbled by the fact that you are here today. I can't imagine what it's like to be a college student during a pandemic. It's been very difficult for all of us. And so I hope that when things get difficult this semester, we will show each other grace.
I'm not going to show you the entire video, but so welcoming, I mean, just think about on your own syllabus, if there are faculty in the audience, you know, how often do we actually say welcome to, welcome to my qualitative methods class. I am so excited that we're going to be together for the next, 14 weeks. And a lot of times, I see syllabi are written, in the third person singular. There is very little of I in them. And what
Hello,
emerged,
if you're receiving
sorry. Okay, so deconstructing is another aspect of the syllabus. What Jennifer has done in her syllabus, this is an artist whose exhibit she saw, a Black artist whose exhibit she saw in New York City at the Museum of Modern Art before the pandemic. And the exhibit was about decentering whiteness as the norm. So she has this image in her syllabus, and she create, and her syllabus for English is around the themes of hope, love, and I can't remember, maybe it was courage. And she used the images of this artist to essentially decenter whiteness. She also uses the work of bell hooks in her syllabus as a way of decentering whiteness. We're here with bell hooks speaking about dominator culture. Bell hooks, for those of you who may not be familiar with her, is in the field of English and a cultural critic. Here is an example of demystify, which is around showing students what's coming up. So here, let me just show you.
Hello, student. My name is Professor Ortiz, and I'm an English faculty member at LA Trade Tech College. I'm sending you a quick video to show you on how you can book an office hours appointment with your professor. We've recently made it easier so you can actually book an appointment through your campus.
So a lot of times we take for granted that students know how to use office hours, how to make appointments with us. And actually, lots of students are apprehensive about it, don't know how to do it. And I have found that to be true even with graduate students who may not feel that they're entitled to take up our time with their concerns or with their questions and so forth. So these are examples of demystifying appointments and office hours. And this one is another example of demystifying.
Now, paragraphs can be a part of a single assignment where I ask you to respond to a question. And paragraphs are also included in essay assignments. But right now, I want to focus on the paragraph format itself.
So here she's explaining to students, what a paragraph is. And so it is possible that these examples are too elementary for UC Santa Cruz, but I am sure that you could use this could be a model for demystifying other things that are relevant at UC, in a UC Santa Cruz classroom. Let me go on. Okay. The other thing is that the notion of validating and how you communicate a belief that all students are capable and expected to succeed. And the way that Jennifer does it is not only by providing lots of information around resources, but what you see here is her Friday playlist, and which she shares with her students. And in a way is showing how, you know, music can be poetry, and also it's music that her students identify with. And she also has, now that we're in the pandemic and in a virtual environment, she has a virtual study hall every Friday where she logs in, she's there, and students can log in, they can do their work, they can ask her questions, and it's a way of communicating, creating a partnership. How she does representing, in addition to including works by Black and Latinx and Indigenous authors, she also uses, what she shows with these videos is, I'm sure you have heard about grit. Grit has been a very popular thing in higher education. But when it is applied to racially minoritized students, grit can sound like much more like the bootstrap theory. And so in order to help students understand the difference, she shows a video of Grit by Angela Duckworth, but also how Bettina Love actually critiques grit. And so she has this comparison as a way of representing a very popular concept being sort of deconstructed by a Black scholar. So let me just, she also uses videos of past students to tell the students that they can be successful in the English course, and to talk about Jennifer as an instructor. And I'm not going to play these. Now, you may be wondering, why does she have everything in video? Well, in part because of the pandemic.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to
Okay. One of the things that I came across as I've been preparing for these kinds of talks is that there is, and actually I came across a syllabus on, if you're familiar with Lemonade, the album by Beyonce, there's a whole syllabus around the album, and which shows how we can use popular culture to actually, teach concepts, poetry, history, and so forth. Okay, so that's, I'm not going to continue talking about the syllabus. I'm going to talk now about data. And again, this is how data can be used at the course departmental level for specific, biology. So what you're seeing here, this is actually something that we're going to do tomorrow with Mass Bay Community College. And the reason why I decided to share it with you is because, again, it's a practice that can be done in your departments. And what this shows is biology, all of biology, for fall 2018 to spring 2020 by race and ethnicity. And somebody earlier asked me, what do you do about small cell data? So one of the things that you can do is do exactly what's here in this slide. Rather than presenting just one semester, you can aggregate to at least see some of the patterns. But we also go further than that. We're funneling down to more specific. So we're looking at 16 sections of biology, and at the success, what it shows is the retention number, retention percentage, success number, success percentage. It is very important to use both numbers and percentages. If you use only percentages, you can miss a lot of detail. And then the next thing that we do is that this is Biology 120, and it shows 4 sections. And the reason why we use the section level, it's not showing here, is because then you can see that there are differences across sections. In other words, that some faculty member can be performing much better with their racially minoritized students than others. And I don't know if it was in this example, let me just see, where, no, I don't think it's here, where I saw that there was one math Latino faculty member, and what really jumped at me immediately was that his class had many, many more Latinx students than any of the other sections. So these are just the kinds of tools that we have created to turn that data that I just showed you into using a formula that is over here, identifying equity gaps, so that you can actually calculate how many more, you have to close equity gaps at UC Santa Cruz. In order to close those equity gaps, you need to know how many more Latinx students, how many more Black students, how many more Indigenous students, how many more Filipino students need to be successful in order to close those equity gaps. And the best way of doing that is by school and by course. In many of the math we have a big math project in Colorado, and there the math faculty actually set numerical goals to close their equity gaps within their courses. Okay, I am coming to the conclusion of my presentation. Let me, 1 minute. So what equity is not? A lot of people think that equity is about disaggregated data. You do need disaggregated data, as I have shown you, but what is really important is how you interrogate the disaggregated data. Oops, you see, there's my alarm. Rather than saying, why are Black students not performing as well as white students, the question to ask is, why is it that in this math classroom, I, as a faculty member, I am so much more successful with white students than I am with Black students? That's the question to ask of the data. So what the data are telling you is not about the students' performance, but they're telling you about the performance of the institution, the department, or the course. So that is one of the ways in which you avoid making deficit attributions of the students. The deficit is in our practices. Equity is not a tagline at the end of a sentence. I see this a lot, and that people feel like, okay, I plugged it in, check the box. It is not caring about all students. So in order to do this work, we can't say, I care about all students equally, because when we say all students, the imagined all student is always a white student. That's why we have to be critically race conscious. We need to notice who comes to see us during our office hours. We do need to notice who drops out, which is what Jason said he had not been paying attention to before he did this work with us. And equity is not about salvationism. It's not about feeling sorry for los pobrecitos. It is actually, it's perhaps feeling sorry for ourselves for not being better at doing this kind of work. So equity is about racial inequity created by faulty assumptions. One of those assumptions is universalism. So when we say all students, that's universalist thinking. And Robin DiAngelo, who wrote about white fragility, speaks about this. And in our book, which some of you may have been reading, we describe universalism and discuss examples of how it becomes an obstacle to equity-mindedness. Another obstacle is uncritical self-referencing. A lot of times when I do this work, people will respond to me, well, I am also first generation. I came from a poor family. And so, I also experienced this inequalities. And the point is that white poverty is not the same as racial inequality, nor is it the same as, for instance, as Lyndon B. Johnson. Some of you may be too young to remember who he is. He was the president in 1965 when UC Santa Cruz was founded. And he made the point, Black poverty is not the same as white poverty. And so we cannot try to substitute racial equity or racial inequity with poverty talk. Racial inequity, to address this problem, we have to think about how we're framing the problem. And I already spoke about framing it as an institutional performance issue, a learning issue for us as practitioners and as leaders. A lot of times we have too much faith in our anti-racism and our goodness. We think of ourselves as being good people, therefore we don't have to address this issue specifically. I see this a lot. And finally, when we hoard power, as I tried to show with that sculpture, that defeats the project of racial inequity. So thank you so much for being here with me. And I think that now I get to answer some questions, and then we will all go home and have a drink.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Estela. If you want to stop sharing, then we can see you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, there.
So thank you so much for this talk and for teaching us and for giving us an opportunity yet again to learn as first generation equity practitioners. We have some questions that have come in, but I want to just take a moment to say, please bring your questions. We will anonymize the questions. And so anything that you would like to ask, I really want to encourage you to ask. If you also don't want your question anonymized, then you can say, please say who asked this question. So we want to offer both of those opportunities. So we have two questions to begin with, either of which could take us the next hour and 10 minutes. So the first one is specific to this institution. How do we move from awareness to action? How do we create institutional change despite a host of individuals who care deeply about these issues? I feel that there is a lot of talk and not a lot of walk on our campus at the institutional level. So you talked a lot about, I'm paraphrasing here, you talked a lot about individual instructor responsibility. And I think that's really valuable. This person is talking about institutional responsibility. And then the example, which is one of my favorite examples, is incentive structures, she writes, don't align, e.g. merit and promotion, with these goals in a real way that translates into real outcomes for real students. How do we make these ideas real? And I would add, and you alluded to this earlier today, how do we make these ideas real at a research institution where teaching is not the only thing that people do?
Yeah. So I did mention that institutionalized racism runs through the veins of our institutions. And so the merit system might be one which produces racialized outcomes, but it can be corrected. But the way that it is corrected is, first, you really need to map out how merit works at UC Santa Cruz. And because merit is inscribed in documents, in policies, in faculty handbooks, in departmental practices. So first, you need to understand how it works in order to be able to pinpoint how it is creating racialized outcomes. So I would say, for instance, when I was at USC, I taught doctoral students, and many of my students were Black and Latinx students, Asian American as well, who chose to work with me. And many of them had started their own education at community colleges. And they were not likely to be picked by my colleagues. So, but I was never rewarded, for doing this. And so that's, incentives can be changed. So incentives can be changed to reward faculty who are actually taking on students. And that's an example, a graduate program. And there are many other ways in which they can, we can change incentives, particularly annual faculty evaluation. The UC system uses that STEP promotion, right? The STEP system. So examining that STEP system, if you can. So that's what so getting back to equity talk, equity walk, the examples that I gave you are examples of equity walk. So what I would say, and I said this earlier today when speaking to the Hispanic Serving Institution Committee, if you identify the top 20 high-risk courses for Latinx and Black students, if that's where your equity gaps are, what I would do is I would take those 20 courses, I would line them up in terms of sections, I would get the data for each of those sections, I would engage the faculty members who teach those courses and in an activity to look at those data and actually move from that to maybe observing the classes, observing their practices, examining their syllabi, but they have to be involved in doing it. But that's the way that you're going to begin to address those gaps that you have to close. You need to find out where they're being created because they may not be equally spread out.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, it does. And I really love the idea of combining what you've said about those 20 courses with what we're trying to do in Project Real, which Lori alluded to, which is a course redesign protocol. But the extra step would be then to outreach specifically to those 20 courses to say, would you like to come? And because we do all those things that you've talked about, we bring data, we look at the syllabi, we use research-based redesign. But I think the idea that we should also not just have people self-select into those opportunities, but really bring them to the places where they're needed most is.
Yeah, I also would say that, with this, your institutional researcher, and maybe you already did this, is to actually look at how many more, Latinx students need to be successful in, English 101, in order to be able to start closing those gaps and create goals that can be monitored. Unless we do that, we're creating programs. We're creating programs looking for programs looking for problems.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic point because we have recently started bringing dashboards to faculty. So that's something that CITL does. It'll do an equity analysis. This is your work has influenced us, but we haven't done that step of saying, and this is what it would mean to be successful. So that's actually, that's a great, I hope my colleagues from CITL are taking notes tonight. Okay, now that I know that everyone can see who asked the questions, I will actually attribute the questions. So Enrico Ramirez Ruiz, great champion of CITL, asks the following question, which is such a great question. In response to COVID-19, universities pivoted rapidly from in-class learning to digital course instruction. So gave the lie to the idea, right, that we can't change quickly. Student tuition was deemed essential, thus swift change ensued. Do you think if equity, diversity, and inclusion are truly deemed essential in the same way at those same institutions, change could occur more swiftly? If we want to see a progressive movement toward establishing and maintaining equitable spaces, is the first step needed that our institution deems these changes as essential?
You mean the changes in tuition or the changes in digital learning?
Well, I think the question is, we managed to put an entire university online in 1 week. So if we can do that, doesn't that show us that if we really had urgency around closing those equity gaps, that we could do it? Right?
Absolutely. And absolutely, the pandemic, the response was amazing, but so that's a good news. We did lose a lot of students, and maybe not in the UC system, but the community colleges have lost 17% of their enrollment that are not returning to college. So because there are just so many inequalities involved in who gets access to internet to be able to do what we are doing here together today. But yes, when circumstances are such, we can change. Yes, just like I gave the example of Cal Lutheran University changing its faculty hiring because WASC called them on it.
Yeah, and that's where these external bodies, as much as we really are suspicious of them, they can also push us in ways that it's hard to push ourselves. Okay, next question. Important question for us. This is the place where the comparison to community colleges breaks down for people like me in the work that we do. And that is many high barrier courses are also very large, 350 to 600 students. How can we leverage our limited resources to some of these individual follow through ideas and data parsing that you're recommending when we're working at that level?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a good answer for you other than I think that the creative things that I showed you that Jennifer did, I think they probably can also be done for large classrooms. And I imagine that in large classrooms, it's really easy for students to get lost. And so one has to find equivalent ways of making them feel connected. But unfortunately, I don't have that experience. And most of the institutions we work with don't have those large classes. And I guess what I would say is that maybe there needs to be a rethinking of that. And you also have teaching assistants that work with those large classes. So those teaching assistants are quite critical, and you're already working on that.
Yeah, that's a super powerful lever for us. And I think, for the researchers in the room, it's not something that a lot of research has been done on. And so it's, I think that we are putting a lot of eggs in that basket because we also recognize the demands that are on the faculty here. And I should say that Nandini asked that question. So I should not have anonymized her. Okay, next question. Can you provide more specific examples of hoarding power? What does that look like at the faculty level? I love this question. At the institutional level, I bet you can provide some examples of what hoarding power looks like.
Yeah, I mean, we hoard power in who gets endowed chairs. We hoard power in terms, when for those of us, because I worked a lot with grants, it's who we invite to
Mhm.
be part of our grants, or whether we share the hidden curriculum of getting grants, for instance. We maybe hoard power in terms of honors programs, fellowships, international travel. I think it goes on all of the time. And I think that often women also lose out when power is hoarded. It's not just racially. Women have been the victims
Mhm.
of power hoarding. And some of it is very obvious, and some it's more hidden. And that's why I'm a great believer in mapping out practices. How do we make decisions about endowed chairs? Why is it that all the endowed chairs tend to be men, or at least they were in my institution?
Yeah.
I think, my institution uses the honorific of university professors given to only about 25 faculty members. And I was awarded that, but I think I may have been the first Latina to have that title. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe this is a place where, being a public institution and being a young institution means that in some ways we have less power to hoard. It doesn't mean that we have no power to hoard, but we have a little bit less.
Yeah. We should ask Angela Davis.
Yes. Okay. So the next question is, how can we use disaggregated data about minoritized groups that are present in very small numbers to inform our racial equity walk, and for instance, Black students at UCSC?
Yeah, I know that you have a small number, and all the reason why you could be more successful with them, because you have a small number, you can pay even more attention to them. I imagine that being a Black student at UC Santa Cruz, and if you find yourself as being the only one in certain classes, that might be a unique experience that you need to pay attention to. So small numbers can be turned into an opportunity for greater attention.
Yeah, great. And we've certainly seen that with the outcomes from Aaron Jones's Black Academy, which has radically transformed the outcomes for the students who go through that. So I just want to give a shout out to that, and really, to amplify that great point that low numbers can actually be a positive.
So it's 7:04 p.m.
Yeah.
How about if I take 2 more questions?
Okay, I am going to go in order because it is not appropriate for me to read through and select. So we have a question from a wonderful colleague, Kem, in the teaching and learning sphere at Davis, who asks, how can those outside of faculty and senior admin roles lead up to those in such positions to take responsibility for equity and anti-racism efforts? So this is a question about managing up. What are ways to keep those institutional leaders accountable and attentive to these matters? Because as you say, the faculty don't have unlimited power, but they have a very particular kind of power, and they have ways to make themselves heard that's much more challenging. And I say this as someone who now works primarily with staff. So how do those outside of those faculty and senior admin roles keep these priorities on the radar?
Yeah, I think that that staff can do many of the same things that I described. We were recently working with Harvey Mudd College, and private, highly selective, science-oriented institution. And we work with their staff in student support services, and they kind of felt like they didn't have much power. But when we work with them in terms of how they could develop measures of equity in advising, in tutoring. They realized that actually they could do a lot more than they realized. So what I would say is, start with the kinds of practices that I shared, inquiry, and you can model that for the people who are higher up. And I'm a great believer in that we should do what we can, we think about what we can control, and we can control the artifacts that we use so as staff, as lawyers, as doctors, we all have a practice. Yoga people have a practice. So that practice is supported by artifacts. And those artifacts are the key to deconstructing racialization. So that's what I would say to you. Think about, if you're a staff member, think about the artifacts that you use to do your practice and how you can understand how racialization may be happening within your own area and what you can do about it. I hope that makes sense.
It does to me. I'm going to end with this question. I am going to pick and choose, and I'm going to end with this question. I've read the same piece on DEI in Inside Higher Ed yesterday. It's the talk of the town. And I'm wondering how we can move from using DEI instrumentally to embedding DEI because of the moral imperative to do so. It seems that the moral imperative leads directly to an anti-racist imperative.
Yeah. I mean, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the University of Michigan in terms of using race for admissions, using that it was an educational benefit, I was happy that the University of Michigan won, but at the same time, I felt like we lost something. And so the way that you change that is, well, I would urge you to look at how you define diversity at UC Santa Cruz, and that's where you can begin to make the change. I think it's the moral imperative of racial equity lives in what you pay attention to, and so I would urge you to ask yourselves, just even go to your website. I said to the Hispanic Serving Institution Committee, why don't you develop the leading indicators of Hispanic servingness and maybe put them on your website? So I've always said that, I have never done this work at USC. And in part because it's very difficult to work in your own institution. Sometimes to ask those fine-grained questions and to do what I said before about looking at artifacts, for some reason, it's hard for us to do that, to discipline ourselves to do it. It's even hard for me. And so often we have to be put into a structured situation where we are being guided through it. And that's the reason why institutions of higher education are always used as an example of institutions that don't know how to learn, even though they have a lot of data. And that's because we don't have the structures for that kind of learning. It's really hard. So,
but this is such a beautiful takeaway, your focus on language and going back to, what Cindy and Lori and I were all trying to say about the history of UCSC. I mean, at the end of the day, we do have control about how we make our arguments about racial justice. And this campus has a history of making moral arguments about racial justice. And when we start borrowing liberally from the Harvard Business Review to make arguments about how diversity is good for business, we have a history that can help us stop ourselves from doing that. And I think, one of my big takeaways from tonight will be watch how you make your arguments about racial equity and beware of some of the instrumentalization that has crept in even to our own work at Siddle, you know, because that's not necessarily going to get us to the place that we're trying to go.
No, remember, Audre Lorde said, you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
You cannot.
Or something like that, yeah.
That's right. So Estella, thank you so much for coming and being with us and teaching us and helping us to become better learners and keeping us honest. And I really look forward to future opportunities to learn with you. And I made you a promise that I would bring you to campus one day, and we will make that actually happen.
All right, thank you. Don't wait too long because I'll be too old.
No, we'll do it as soon as we all get these masks off and we can bring you up here. So
Okay,
thank you everyone for being here,
and thank you everyone. Yes.
have a
Okay.
beautiful night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.